Summoning Evil, the terrifying truth behind a Ouija board game audio short story. Chapter 1, The Dare. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of Sophie's house as rain lashed against the glass. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast, a warm glow from the fireplace, the scent of popcorn lingering in the air, and the sound of laughter filling the living room. 5 teenagers, close as siblings, were gathered around the coffee table, surrounded by blankets and pillows, ready for a night of stories and fun. Emily sat cross-legged, her brow furrowed slightly as she listened to the others. She had always been the careful one, the voice of reason among them, and tonight, that trait was as strong as ever. Jason, sitting beside her, rolled his eyes, his skepticism barely concealed. He was the group's resident cynic, always ready to debunk any myth or rumor, and the idea of anything supernatural was laughable to him. Mia, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with excitement. Her curiosity was insatiable, always eager to explore the unknown, and tonight was no exception. She leaned in closer, her eyes wide with anticipation. Across from her, Liam smirked, his mind already spinning with ideas for pranks he could pull on the others. Known for his mischievous streak, he never missed an opportunity to stir up trouble. But it was Sophie who held everyone's attention. Confident and bold, she was the fearless leader of their group, always the first to suggest something daring. And tonight, she had something special planned. As lightning flashed outside, casting eerie shadows across the room, Sophie stood up and reached for something tucked behind the old armchair. She turned back to the group, holding up a large, dusty box with a triumphant grin. "Look what I found in my grandmother's attic," she announced, her voice tinged with a note of excitement that was hard to ignore. Emily's eyes widened as Sophie placed the box on the table and opened it to reveal an old Ouija board. The wood was worn, the letters and numbers faded with age, and the planchette lay on top, as if waiting for them. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. "Are you serious, Sophie? That's a Ouija board!" Jason let out a snort. "Oh, come on, it's just a game. There's no such thing as ghosts." He leaned back, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. But Mia's eyes sparkled as she looked at the board. "This is going to be so cool. We could actually talk to a spirit." Liam grinned, already planning his next move. Or at the very least, freak each other out. Sophie waved off Emily's concern with a flick of her hand. "It's just for fun, Em. We're not actually going to summon anything. What's the harm in trying?" Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to walk away, but the eagerness in everyone's eyes made her stay. She didn't want to be the one to ruin the night. With a sigh, she gave in. "Fine, but if something goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Sophie set the board on the table, and the group gathered around, each placing their fingers on the planchette. The mood in the room shifted, the laughter fading as a tense silence took its place. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, and the storm outside grew louder, as if nature itself was reacting to what they were about to do. "Is anyone here?" Sophie asked, her voice steady, though her eyes flicked around the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Jason let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "See? Nothing. It's just a..." Before he could finish, the planchette jerked under their fingers, sliding slowly across the board. All the laughter stopped as they watched in silence, hearts pounding. The planchette moved deliberately, spelling out a name, Malik. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. The air in the room grew cold, and the candles flickered ominously. "This isn't funny, Sophie," she whispered, but Sophie's confident expression had slipped into something more serious, more afraid. "It's not me," Sophie replied, her voice barely audible. She swallowed hard and asked, "Malik, who are you?" The planchette began to move again, faster this time. The letters spelled out cryptic messages, fragmented words that made little sense but carried a heavy sense of foreboding. Leave. And now, Liam's grin faded as the realization of what was happening set in. "Guys, maybe we should stop." Emily nodded vigorously. "We need to say goodbye, now." But when they tried to move the planchette to the word goodbye, it refused to budge, stuck in the center of the board. Panic began to rise, the fear in the room palpable. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, making them all jump. Hearts racing, they scrambled to their feet, the board forgotten as they rushed to the source of the noise. They found nothing, No sign of what could have caused the sound, no reason for the growing sense of dread that now filled the house. Despite their best efforts to shake off the unease, the seed of fear had been planted, and none of them could deny the dark presence that seemed to linger in the shadows. They returned to the living room, trying to laugh it off, but the tension remained, unspoken but undeniable. As they settled in for the night, no one noticed the slight movement of the planchette, inching slowly towards the letter M. Chapter 2: Unseen Forces. The storm had passed, but an unsettling tension lingered long after that night. It was as if something had shifted in the air, an invisible presence clinging to their lives. Over the next few days, the group found themselves haunted by strange and inexplicable events that defied logic. Emily was the first to notice. It started with small things, her belongings subtly rearranged, a shadow flitting past in the corner of her eye, or the soft murmur of her name when she was alone. At first, she tried to dismiss these occurrences as tricks of the mind, but the incidents grew more frequent and impossible to ignore. One evening, as she sat at her desk studying, her bedroom door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, without a breeze to explain it. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she froze, staring at the door. Her heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. Then, just as silently as it had opened, the door closed again. Emily sprang to her feet, hands trembling, and checked the lock. It was still in place. No one was there. The following morning, Emily gathered the courage to talk to the others. When she met with them, the unease in their eyes confirmed her suspicions. They were all experiencing something similar. Yet, none of them wanted to admit it. Liam was the first to dismiss her concerns, his tone laced with sarcasm. "So what, Emily? You think the board actually did something? It's just a game." But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. Jason crossed his arms, refusing to acknowledge any possibility beyond a rational explanation. "This is ridiculous. We're just psyching ourselves out. Liam's probably messing with us." He cast a suspicious glance at Liam, who rolled his eyes in response. Mia said nothing, her usual curiosity dimmed by an underlying fear that seemed to hang over her like a dark cloud. She sat apart from the group, her gaze distant, as if she were lost in a place they couldn't reach. Sophie tried to maintain her usual confident demeanor, but there was a tightness in her voice when she spoke. "We just need to confront whatever this is and put an end to it. Running scared won't solve anything." Despite their bravado, the tension between them grew. The atmosphere that had once been filled with laughter and camaraderie was now thick with suspicion and fear. Every creak, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind felt like a threat, and it wasn't long before the paranoia set in. Late one night, Jason was jolted awake by the feeling of someone standing over him. He opened his eyes to find no one there, but the sensation of being watched remained. His heart pounded as he sat up, scanning the room, but all he found were shadows, deeper and darker than they should have been. In the corner, something seemed to move, a shape, barely discernible, almost like a figure looming in the darkness. But when he blinked, it was gone. The next day, Emily called an emergency meeting at the local cafe, desperate to make them understand. "We have to face it. There's something wrong, and it's not just our imaginations. We've brought something evil into our lives." Liam leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. "So what do you suggest we do? Get an exorcist?" Emily ignored his sarcasm. "We need help. Real help. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Holloway. She's known for dealing with things like this. Maybe she can tell us what to do." Mia looked up at the mention of Mrs. Holloway, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "Do you really think she can help us?" "It's worth a try," Emily insisted, her voice trembling with urgency. "We can't just sit here and let things get worse." Reluctantly, the group agreed, driven by the fear that had taken root in their hearts. That evening, they made their way to Mrs. Holloway's home, a small, weathered cottage on the outskirts of town. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its shadowy silhouette framed by the setting sun. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood as they approached the door. Mrs. Holloway greeted them with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting their arrival. Her eyes were sharp, piercing, yet filled with a warmth that was oddly comforting. She led them into a cozy, dimly lit room, where the scent of burning sage hung in the air. The walls were lined with shelves of ancient books and strange trinkets, and in the center of the room sat a round table with a single candle flickering on it. As they sat down, Mrs. Holloway listened intently to their story, her expression growing more grave with each word. When they finished, she remained silent for a long moment, her gaze distant as if she were looking beyond the room, beyond the physical world. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You've awakened something that should have remained dormant. Malik is not just a spirit, he's a vengeful entity, bound to the board by forces you cannot begin to understand. He feeds on your fear, your doubts, your anger. The more you give in to those emotions, the stronger he becomes." A chill settled over the group as her words sank in. Sophie, for the first time, looked genuinely shaken. "What do we do? How do we stop him?" Mrs. Holloway's eyes darkened as she leaned forward. "You must perform a ritual to close the connection, to sever the ties between this world and the one he comes from. But it won't be easy. The ritual must be done where the spirit was summoned, in the place where you used the board." "And what if we fail?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman's expression grew even more serious. "If you fail, Malik will break free from the board entirely. He'll no longer be confined to shadows and whispers. He will manifest in full, and when that happens, there will be no stopping him." The gravity of her words weighed heavily on them, the reality of their situation sinking in like a stone. This was no longer a game, no longer a dare. They had set something terrible in motion, and if they didn't act soon, it could destroy them all. As they left Mrs. Holloway's home, the setting sun cast long shadows on the ground, and the wind whispered through the trees. Emily felt the darkness pressing in around them, felt Malik's presence growing stronger with each passing moment. She knew that time was running out, and that they had only one chance to set things right before it was too late. Chapter 3: The Ritual. The evening sky hung heavy with thick clouds as the group made their way back to Sophie's house. A foreboding silence surrounded them, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Each step felt heavier than the last, the gravity of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Sophie led the way, her usual confidence replaced by a grim determination. Emily walked beside her, clutching the small bundle of sage Mrs. Holloway had given them. Behind them, Jason, Liam, and Mia followed, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. None of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate for the task ahead. As they reached Sophie's house, it loomed before them like a shadowy sentinel. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and the air around the house felt thick, almost suffocating. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, an oppressive energy filled the air, prickling at their skin. "Let's get this over with," Sophie muttered, trying to keep her voice steady. But the house seemed to have other plans. As they moved through the rooms, setting up the candles and arranging the Ouija board in the center of the living room, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered erratically, plunging them into darkness before flaring back to life. Doors slammed shut without warning, causing them to jump in fear. The temperature dropped rapidly, their breath visible in the dim light. It was clear that Malik was aware of their presence, and he was not pleased. "He's angry," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she lit the candles around the board. The flames wavered, as if threatened by an unseen force, but they managed to stay lit. "Stay focused," Sophie ordered, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of Malik. "We can't let him intimidate us." The group gathered around the board, each one of them placing their fingers on the planchette. Mrs. Holloway had insisted that they follow her instructions to the letter. The ritual required precise timing, complete concentration, and unwavering resolve. But as they stood there, the weight of their fear threatened to break their resolve. With the candles lit and the sage burning, Mrs. Holloway began to guide them through the ritual, her voice steady and calm despite the tension in the room. "Light banishes darkness, flame purifies. Spirit of the lost, we send you back to your realm. Malik, return to the shadows." The group repeated her words, their voices shaky at first but growing stronger with each repetition. The planchette on the board began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. It spelled out words, dark, ominous words that made their blood run cold. "Stop. You will." pay. The board's movements became violent, the planchette scraping across the surface with a force that none of them could control. Malik's presence was becoming more intense, more aggressive. The air crackled with energy, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "Don't stop," Mrs. Holloway shouted, her voice rising above the growing chaos. "Keep chanting. Don't let him distract you." The group continued the chant, their voices merging into a desperate chorus. But as they did, the candles flickered, their flames guttering. The wind picked up, howling through the room despite the closed windows. The temperature plummeted further, and a deep, resonant growl filled the space. Then, suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging the room into darkness. A bone-chilling cold swept through, and the group froze in terror. In the pitch-black room, they could feel something moving, something dark, something malevolent. Malik was no longer just a presence, he was manifesting. A shadowy figure began to take shape in the center of the room, its form twisting and writhing like smoke. Red, glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto each of them with a malevolent glare. A twisted grin spread across the shadow's face, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror. This was no longer a game, no longer a simple seance. They had awakened something far more powerful than they could have imagined. Malik was real, and he was coming for them. "Finish the chant," Mrs. Holloway screamed, her voice urgent and commanding. "Do it now!" But the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing them. The dark figure advanced, its presence filling the room with an unbearable pressure. The walls seemed to tremble, and the very air felt thick with dread. Jason's voice cracked as he tried to continue the chant, but the words caught in his throat. Mia was trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Liam, usually so full of bravado, was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with terror. Sophie clenched her teeth, forcing herself to focus. She grabbed Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Together," she whispered. "We do this together." Summoning every ounce of courage, they began the chant again, their voices rising in defiance against the encroaching darkness. "Light banishes darkness. Flame purifies. Spirit of the lost, we send you back to your realm. Malik, return to the shadows." The shadowy figure halted, its grin faltering as the chant took hold. The air vibrated with energy, and the candles suddenly flared back to life, their flames burning brighter than before. The light seemed to push against Malik, forcing him to retreat. Mrs. Holloway joined in, her voice strong and unwavering. "You do not belong here. You are banished from this realm. Return to the darkness from whence you came." The room shook with a violent tremor, and a deafening roar filled their ears. Malik's form began to dissolve, the shadow unraveling as the power of the chant grew. The planchette on the board moved erratically, the words it spelled out now disjointed and desperate. "No, stop, can't hold." With one final shuddering scream, the dark figure exploded into a cloud of black smoke, which was sucked back into the board. The planchette flew off the board, landing with a clatter on the floor. The wind died down, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive presence lifted, leaving the room eerily still. Breathing heavily, the group stared at the now quiet board, their hands still trembling. Malik was gone, banished back to the spirit realm. But the fear, the knowledge of what they had faced, lingered in their minds. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly, her expression weary. "For now, yes. But remember, you must never tamper with forces you do not understand. Malik may be gone, but the consequences of your actions will remain. Respect the boundaries between our world and the spirit realm, or you may not be so lucky next time." The group, still shaken by the experience, exchanged glances. They had survived, but the ordeal had changed them. They knew now that some things should never be disturbed, and some games were far too dangerous to play. Chapter 4: The Twist. The room, still shrouded in the aftermath of the ritual, was eerily silent. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls as the group tried to steady their racing hearts. Relief washed over them like a wave, but it was quickly shattered by the unsettling realization that something was not right. Sophie, who had been their unwavering leader throughout this harrowing ordeal, stood apart from the others. Her eyes, usually bright and determined, now gleamed with a strange intensity. Emily noticed it first, the way Sophie's hands trembled, not with fear, but with something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. "Sophie?" Emily's voice was hesitant, laced with concern. Sophie turned slowly to face the group, a twisted smile curling on her lips. "You think it's over, don't you?" she asked, her voice low and mocking. "You think we've won?" Jason frowned, stepping forward. "What are you talking about? We banished him. Malik is gone." A harsh, bitter laugh escaped Sophie's lips. "Gone? No, Jason. Malik isn't gone. He's here with us, because I brought him here." The room fell into stunned silence. Mia and Liam exchanged horrified glances, while Emily felt a cold dread settle in her chest. "What do you mean?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie's smile faded, replaced by a grim expression. "I knew about Malik long before tonight," she confessed. "I found the Ouija board in my grandmother's attic, yes, but I also found something else, her old journals. She wrote about Malik, about his power, and I was curious. I thought I could control him." Liam's face twisted in disbelief. "You knew about this? You knew the risks, and you still made us do this?" Sophie's eyes flashed with defiance. "I didn't make you do anything. We all chose to play the game. But yes, I knew. I wanted to see if the stories were true. I wanted to see if I could harness his power." Jason stepped back, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "You put all of us in danger just because you were curious? What the hell is wrong with you?" Sophie's face softened for a brief moment, a flicker of regret crossing her features. "I didn't realize how powerful he was," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I thought I could control him, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." Before anyone could react, the air in the room grew thick and oppressive once more. The temperature dropped, and a dark presence began to fill the space. Malik's spirit, weakened but not defeated, lashed out, sending a powerful force through the room that knocked the others aside like rag dolls. They hit the ground hard, groaning in pain, as Malik's sinister laughter echoed around them. Sophie, standing alone in the center of the chaos, realized the full extent of her mistake. Malik wasn't gone. He had only been weakened, and now he was enraged. She could feel his presence swirling around her, a dark energy that promised destruction. "Sophie, what are you doing?" Mia cried out, struggling to get to her feet. "We have to finish the ritual." But Sophie knew it wasn't that simple anymore. Malik was too strong now, and the only way to truly banish him was through a sacrifice, a willing vessel to contain his spirit. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at her friends, knowing what she had to do. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "This is my fault. I have to fix it." Without hesitation, she grabbed the Ouija board and clutched it to her chest. The board seemed to vibrate in her hands, a dark energy pulsing through it. Taking a deep breath, she began to recite the final lines of the chant Mrs. Holloway had taught them, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her heart. The others, realizing what Sophie was doing, cried out in protest. "No, Sophie, there has to be another way," Jason shouted, his voice desperate. But Sophie didn't stop. She continued the chant, her words growing louder and more determined. The room shook violently as Malik's presence tried to overpower her, but Sophie held on, her resolve unshakable. Malik, sensing the opportunity to fully manifest, began to possess Sophie, his dark energy intertwining with her soul. She could feel him inside her, a cold, malevolent force trying to take control. But before he could fully succeed, the others, driven by sheer determination, scrambled to their feet and rushed to Sophie's side. "Join hands," Emily yelled, reaching out to the others. "We have to finish this together." They linked hands around Sophie, forming a protective circle. With trembling voices, they joined her in the chant, their combined strength pushing back against Malik's force. The air crackled with energy as the ritual neared its climax. Sophie's body shook violently as Malik fought to break free, but she held on, using every ounce of her willpower to keep him contained. Her eyes met Emily's, and in that moment, Emily saw the pain and fear in her friend's gaze, but also a fierce determination. Sophie had made her choice. With a final, powerful shout, the group completed the chant. The room exploded with light, and a deafening roar filled their ears as Malik's spirit was forcibly pulled back into the board. The dark energy swirled around Sophie one last time before it was sucked into the board, leaving behind an eerie silence. The Ouija board fell from Sophie's hands, clattering to the floor. The group stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Sophie swayed on her feet, her face pale, her eyes unfocused. She had succeeded in trapping Malik, but the cost was evident. Emily caught Sophie as she collapsed, holding her friend tightly. Sophie's breathing was shallow, her body weak from the ordeal. "Sophie, stay with us," Emily pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Sophie managed a faint smile, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." The others gathered around, their expressions a mix of sorrow and relief. They had banished Malik, but they knew they had lost something irreplaceable in the process. Sophie's sacrifice had saved them, but it had also left them forever changed. As Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, the room grew quiet once more. The ordeal was over, but the memory of what had happened would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Malik was gone, sealed within the board along with Sophie's spirit, but the darkness that had touched their lives would never fully fade. They had survived, but at a cost that none of them could ever forget. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. The dawn broke with a heavy silence, the morning light creeping into Sophie's house, casting long shadows on the walls that had witnessed the unspeakable. The group, huddled together in the aftermath of the night's events, was a shell of what they once were. The loss of Sophie weighed heavily on them, her absence a void they couldn't comprehend. Mrs. Holloway, her face lined with sorrow, carefully picked up the Ouija board. The object now held a different significance, a prison, not just for Malik, but for Sophie as well. Her hands trembled as she turned to the group, her voice firm but gentle. "This board will be sealed away, never to be touched again. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Never meddle with what you do not understand." The words hung in the air, a solemn warning that none of them could ignore. Jason, once so confident and sure of himself, now stared blankly at the floor, his mind replaying the final moments of Sophie's sacrifice. Mia, who had always been the quiet observer, now trembled with a fear that gripped her soul. Liam, usually the skeptic, found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. Emily, holding on to the memory of her best friend, felt a hollowness that words couldn't fill. The group knew they could no longer stay together, bound by a night that had shattered their innocence and revealed the darkness within. One by one, they began to leave, each carrying the weight of the night's horrors. Jason walked out first, his steps heavy with guilt. Mia followed, her eyes red from tears that refused to stop. Liam lingered for a moment, his expression one of deep contemplation, before finally turning away. Emily was the last to leave, her heart aching with a grief that felt too large to bear. She paused at the door, looking back at the house where they had once laughed and shared so many memories. Now, it was nothing more than a tomb, holding the echoes of their folly. She whispered a silent goodbye, not just to Sophie, but to the part of herself that had been lost forever. As she walked away, Emily's mind was consumed with thoughts of what had transpired. The pursuit of power, the reckless curiosity that had driven Sophie to the brink, had led them all to this point. Sophie's desire to control the unknown had been her undoing, and the group had paid the price. The Ouija board, once a source of intrigue, had become a symbol of their arrogance, a deadly reminder that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this lesson was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had always been the cautious one, the voice of reason, but even she had been drawn into the allure of the supernatural. Now, the memory of that night would haunt her, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. The sun was high in the sky by the time Emily reached her home, the warmth of the day doing little to chase away the cold that had settled in her heart. She knew that nothing would ever be the same. The group had been torn apart, and Sophie was gone, lost to the very thing she had sought to control. Across town, Mrs. Holloway returned to her small, dimly lit home, the weight of the Ouija board heavy in her arms. She walked to a corner of the room where a large, ancient chest lay, its surface covered in intricate carvings. She opened it with a heavy sigh, placing the board inside and locking the chest with a key she kept around her neck. As she turned to leave, a soft, barely audible whisper caught her attention. She froze, listening intently. The whispers grew slightly louder, though still faint, like echoes from a far-off place. Mrs. Holloway's heart tightened, a sense of foreboding settling over her. She knew the battle was over, but the war was far from won. Malik was sealed away, but his malevolence lingered, entwined with Sophie's spirit. The chest, now locked, held more than just an object. It held a story that might never truly end. As Mrs. Holloway walked away, the whispers faded into silence, but the feeling of unease remained. The Ouija board was secure, but the lingering darkness hinted at something more. Perhaps in time the chest would be forgotten, buried beneath the dust of years. Or perhaps, one day, someone would find it again, and the whispers would grow louder, calling out to those who dared to listen. The final chapter of Sophie's story was written, but in the shadows, a new one waited to begin. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing short story. See you in the next one.